My name is Krista, and I wanted to just kind of dive in with some conversation. So the invitation was to sit with someone you don't know, and maybe you did this or maybe you didn't, and to think about maybe sitting next to someone as different from you as possible. So maybe you did that and maybe you didn't. It's okay, it doesn't matter. But connect with the person next to you now, and if there's not someone next to you, you can turn around. We're going to start just with some kind of conversation to kind of warm us up, yeah? So introduce yourself to the person next to you, and they'll be your partner. Hi, welcome.
That chair?
No?
Okay, I'm going to have to leave early. So
Sure. Great. Okay, so if nothing else, do you guys do this? I find it actually works really well. It's kind of like grade school-ish, but it works really well. When you see one person raising their hand, then it's like, oh, we're going to stop talking now. That way we can make the most of our time together.
Either that or we'll turn the lights off like in kindergarten.
Yeah, that's fun too. Anyway, so we do this thing. This talk is part of your Diversity and Equity Week. So we do this thing. Anytime we're meeting someone, we tend to kind of size each other up, and we notice how we're the same or we notice how we're different. So consciously or subconsciously. All right, what a great turnout. Consciously or subconsciously, you might have noticed some differences between you and your partner. And so what were the differences that you noticed? I'm going to guess a few that came to me. First one that came to my mind actually was age difference or age diversity. And I love this picture, young man and his grandmother. Ethnic diversity or racial diversity. Role diversity, so here the ethnicity is the same, but the teacher and the student are in different roles and thus having very different experiences in whatever they're doing. Socioeconomic diversity, we try to ignore this, but it's always present. That one was gender diversity, a picture of a young man and a young woman. Being cisgen or transgendered and all of the issues of diversity accompanying LGBTIQ, which is a big part of diversity. Mental and physical ableness, abilities and disabilities, perspectives, and even political, Democrat, Republican, especially in this season. And today I understand Clark is also hosting the Democratic debates. So you might also be aware of your political affiliations. Yeah? This last one is actually one of the biggest determinants in how you are likely to feel about climate change. This is from the famous Yale Six Americas study. And the people that you live and work with tend to influence your opinions and beliefs and perspectives regarding global warming and climate change. So we tend to think the way people like us think. That's why it's so important to talk about issues like climate change, climate disruption, global warming, whatever you want to call it. It's very important to talk about these issues across difference. I don't know about you, but I like to think for myself. And in order to find out what I think it's really important to talk to people different from me, yeah? Wow, we're getting even more people. This is awesome. So you already met somebody. So talk with your partner. I'm going to give you some time, and we'll do the hand thing. And if it gets really intense, we'll do the lights thing to know when to switch partners. Come on in. You're going to talk with your partner about how something or someone that you care about might be affected by anticipated impacts from climate change or climate disruption. So if you're not sure what to talk about, this is where you might be glad that you're not at my last talk, which was called Sink, Burn, Blown Away, Dislocated. This was a talk at the, come on in, at the accrediting agency for the Western region, California, Oregon, Washington, American Samoa, and Guam. And talking about how issues related to climate impacts might be relevant for community colleges in particular and might be part of accreditation standards, which currently they're not. Yeah. Oh, I don't know why the slides are a little bit off center, but we can fill that in, I'm sure. So the summary of that talk, this is just a suggestion of what you and your partner can discuss. Heat waves, storm severity, droughts, floods, food, fire is the missing one there, human migrations, social and political unrest, species extinction, and sea level rise. If there are other anticipated impacts of climate change that you're aware of or thinking about or want to talk to your partner about, you can do so, okay? So I'm gonna go back to this slide and give you a chance to just talk and talk about how any one of those issues that relates to climate change or global warming might affect you, a person you care about, a place you care about, animals you care about, something you like to do, yeah? We'll give each partner about 2 minutes or 5 or 6 minutes total. When you see my hand go up or the lights, that's a suggestion to switch partners and let each person talk for about 2 minutes. Clear? Can you guys deal with, you know what to talk about? Okay, great.
I'm on the Civic Engagement Committee. Corey.
Oh, nice, Corey.
That's
What?
where your slides are on your mat.
Yeah. Should I change the?
You can you have it on a flash drive to kick it over? Or email?
I have a flash drive.
It's not on this?
No, that's my clicker.
Oh.
Yep. It's called Higher Ground. Yeah.
Texas?
2.
Yeah.
Version 2. Can this go somewhere? What?
Yep.
I just want to get a sense of what people are talking about.
Oh, we were just talking about how, like, we've read some stuff that says, like, in those 17 more months until climate change, like, kills us all. There's probably not. But then there's some people that are actually saying, like, 12 years, which is, like,
Not that much better, really. I think it's really important to get away from those kind of big, scary abstractions to what I call like climate reality and look at these anticipated impacts. So like, okay, sea level rise or flooding, you know. I know that you experience that here in Houston. Okay, how's that really going to affect me now? And get away from collapse of civilization. If you're able to stay for the second activity, we're going to look at some of those future scenarios and think about the time scale that we're talking about with climate change. Because, yeah, you can't live that way. I'm just taking a little read of what people are talking about.
We're talking about like the Amazon forest and like rising sea levels.
Okay, sea level rise. So how is that going to affect you?
I mean, Galveston. Yeah, rising sea levels. Like housing.
More flooding, more housing. People talking about retreating back from those areas. So people will move from Galveston to Houston or other places in the state. So some population fluctuation, probably some impacts on jobs. Maybe, so I don't want to say like good things, but you know, maybe it's not all a disaster. Like, who will those people be, and what will they bring to your community? You know, maybe it's not all bad. I don't know. But yeah, those are big issues. Switching partners, if you didn't both get a chance to talk, you can take 2 more minutes, maybe talk about something else. Just wanted to give you an indication to switch or finish up your conversation. 2 more minutes. Wow, you guys got so quiet. Yeah. I just want to take a little read of what people are talking about. What are you all talking about?
We're talking about, like, as far as the global change, like I mentioned how they were going to put a high-speed train close to where we lived, and there's a lot of like farmers and crops around our house. He mentioned animals because he lives out in the country. We have animals too.
Station, and there's like a lot of people taking down trees in Magnolia right now. I mean, taking down trees. And whenever I moved there like 3 years ago, there were like a lot of deer. And now that they still cut down so many trees, there's like nothing. And you would see them like being ran.
Right.
So like they're just chasing the animals out of their habitat.
And so do the deer, are they going into urban areas, or are they moving, or are they just...
They kind of stay there, but some of them they got killed, like they ran them over.
Right.
And then from then on, I haven't really seen many of them.
Right. A lot of animal extinctions are occurring, and you know, we're connected to animals. Like in Hawaii, we have whales and dolphins, and like they're mammals. You know, we're connected to them. And then, of course, some animals thrive under these conditions, like ticks, Lyme disease, you know, rats, cockroach in Hawaii.
That's why I tell people not to kill possum.
Why?
They eat ticks. In
Oh.
your yard, like ticks jump on them, they eat ticks.
Wow.
Yeah.
Cool. I learned something today. That's really interesting.
You see a possum, don't try to chase it off too quickly.
Don't go near the possum. It's your friend.
He's in the yard. He's in the
Right.
house.
Well, when one population decreases, you know, there might be certain symbiosis that gets thrown off. You know, you think you don't want possums, but you do, because they're helping you with ticks. So that's a great point. Thanks. Wow, what a great hubbub. So these issues that you were talking about, and we moved the presentation over so the slides would be evened out. These issues that you're talking about, do they affect all people equally or not? That's what I want to talk about here just for a couple minutes and see maybe what came up in your conversation. So for example, an example of climate justice or environmental justice or environmental equity. Hi, you guys, come on in. Yeah. We actually haven't even gotten started yet. This is just warm-up dialogue, believe it or not. So for example, heat waves, right? The first one on this list. Right now in urban Honolulu, where I live, we are mapping temperatures in different neighborhoods. So some neighborhoods, particularly lower income neighborhoods, might have fewer trees, more concrete, be less likely to have air conditioning installed. So a heat wave is going to impact a lower income neighborhood differently than a more affluent neighborhood that might have air conditioning. And there's things we could do about that. If we know that, then we can plant trees, rooftop gardens, and anticipate how heat waves will affect different neighborhoods or different people differently. Heat waves are also going to affect elderly more than they're going to affect, young people in their 20s. For the elderly, there's a lot of risk with heat waves. And one of my colleagues at University of Hawaii, Camila Mora, has done a lot of research. I think there are 82 different ways to die in a heat wave. And that's his field of study. So that's my example. What did you come up with as an example of maybe some impacts of climate change that will be felt differently by different groups of people? How do we make climate change, how does it look through a lens of diversity and equity? Did anything like that come up in your conversations, or what do you think? Yes, sir.
Well, I have a family up in Alberta, Canada, and they have a lot of trees still, so there's a lot of coal mining still. But when they fall into coal, because there's so many trees, there's a carbon negative output. But the nationwide carbon cutting taxes cause tons of people in the area to lose their jobs.
Okay, so an economic intervention that affects different socioeconomic groups differently and impacts jobs. Great example of an equity issue. What else? Let's just come up with maybe 2 or 3. What else? Oh, yes, thank you.
We were talking about like people on the coast when hurricanes and like flood, sea levels rise, like their homes will get destroyed, like going inland.
So who lives on the coast? Where are those vulnerable communities located? I mean, like in Hawaii, sea level rise, let's just take sea level rise as an issue. It's interesting because it's going to affect a lot of different communities. In Hawaii, there's a lot of really fancy houses on the coastline. And so that's actually an issue where sea level rise is going to affect all communities. Nobody is like exempt from climate impacts. At a certain point, species extinctions and air quality and water quality affect all of us, but is always lower income communities and women will tend to be impacted first and impacted most significantly. Yeah? Any other thoughts? Yes, thank you.
What happened in Nebraska this spring in terms of floodwater? 69 of the 90+ counties were underwater for an extended period of time. Delayed the planting season, had an impact on beef because Nebraska is a big exporter of beef to other communities. The corn crop and all of that was adversely affected. So economically, it can affect households in terms of their purchasing power because of that, and the farmers and the ranchers who raise beef and who grow corn.
Right?
Their economic livelihood is totally dissipated as a result of that.
Right? That's amazing that you brought up that example. I'm actually from Nebraska, and my family are actually corn farmers. So yeah, crops get wiped out. It affects the farmers, but it also affects everybody's food prices down the food distribution chain. So when food prices go up, what's going to go up with that? Food insecurity, which might be an issue you're talking about on your campus. Who is most affected by an increase in food prices? Again, lower socioeconomic status, lower income communities will be impacted by food increases, right? And in Lincoln, in that Nebraska flooding, people were without fresh water for, just for like a week during that flooding. But I never heard anybody in Lincoln talking about climate impacts and seeing themselves as vulnerable to climate change. This is a Florida thing, right? But not really. So climate as an equity issue. The next question that I want to ask you is, how does this, thinking about these issues, how does it make you feel? So if you have a piece of paper handy, there's actually one other place where I'm going to ask you to write something down. Right now, I just want you to write down, you don't even have to share it with anybody. You could even write it just on your margin or on your hand. How did that conversation make you feel? We talked about climate impacts for about 15 minutes. I want you to check in with yourself right now, just yourself, just you, not anybody else. How does thinking about these issues make you feel? So you can do a little, write down just one word. Did anybody write down any of these words? I'm just curious. Okay. Yes, 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 yes. In the focus group surveys that we conducted across the University of Hawaii system, these were the most commonly mentioned emotion words. Each of these words was mentioned at least 10 times by different groups of students. So in the survey that we're going to talk about today, these are the emotions that came up most frequently, and I'm going to get into that later. So that's why I want you to just write down, what was that emotion word that came up for you? Okay, so we're going to have some more chance to talk later. That was, as I said, just a little kind of warm-up conversation. This is actually the title slide for today's talk, Moving to Higher Ground, Climate Resilience, Climate Justice, and Anxiety, but I just took the word climate out. We're going to talk about resilience, justice, and anxiety. I'm going to pause here and let Clark, I guess, introduce me or say anything that he'd like to say about today or this series. Thanks for having me, Clark.
And thanks everyone for coming, and it's great to see standing room only and here for this important talk during the Diversity Summit the last couple of days. Raise your hand if you were at some of the events yesterday for the Diversity Summit. Any of you? Yeah, a few of you? Okay, that's great. We have more activities today at 11 o'clock and at 12:30 in E100, so if you're interested in being able to continue with those, we'd be glad to have you. If you haven't silenced your phone, you should do that while you're thinking about it right now, just so it doesn't go off during Dr. Heiser's presentation. Dr. Heiser, as you know, is from Hawaii. She's with the University of Hawaii Sustainability, but she's also Kapiolani Community College's Professor of Composition and Rhetoric, and she represents different organizations around the country that are interested in sustainability education, especially in higher ed, and that's why I brought her here today, because I feel like that is an important facet to a discussion of equity in our society. When we think about inclusion and diversity and equity, we think a lot about people of different races and different genders and so on like that. But what about the impact that climate has on different groups and the inclusion and equity there, right? And I think that that's why I was so excited. And this presentation is about a year in the making. We've been talking about it for some time. And I'm very excited to finally get her here to talk with you about this. One thing to offer to you is that it's very exciting, at the end of this talk at 11, she would like to have a group of people to help her test out what could easily be called a tabletop, innovative, interactive experience. I'm not sure it's a game necessarily, but it's a kind of thing that is intended to take your perception and put it on the head, right? Put it over a little bit about kind of thing. So she's rolling out this timeline that she's brought with her. And we're going to try to test it out. If never been done before, we really do that. If you're interested in hearing this talk and saying, well, I'd like to know more
Thanks, Clark. This is the Great Timelines transition activity that my colleague Matt Lynch and I have been developing. So if you're able to stay in the second session, you can help me test that out. As Clark said, this talk has been percolating for a while, and it's probably the most complicated talk I've ever given. For starters, I've never had a title slide with the Native Hawaiian flag on it before. Even though I've lived in Hawaii for 20 years, obviously I'm not Native Hawaiian, and I don't usually, boy, it made me out of breath rolling that, that scroll out. I didn't know I was gonna do that. Anyway, speaking about Native Hawaiian issues has never felt like my kuleana or my responsibility to do. But I'm gonna talk a little bit today about what's happening right now on Mauna Kea. Is anybody tracking this action that's happening on Mauna Kea? Can you give us a synopsis?
Well, so there's a move to add some additional telescopes to the top of the mountain, which is a sacred space for Native Hawaiians. So there's a lot of activism happening at the base of the mountain.
Yeah, at the top of the mountain. Yeah, the kupuna, the elders have been camped. Do you want to add something? Oh, because he's standing with Mauna Kea. Yeah, well, yeah, interesting. I didn't know that. There's a group on the top of the mountain. The kupuna, the elders, have been camped across the road. I think this is day 50, so over a month. And the camp up there swells to over 1,000. There's been up to 5,000 people on the top of the mountain standing with them. And it's really rippling across the state and affecting everyone. So what I share about Mauna Kea is really from my experience as a witness. And we're gonna talk about Mauna Kea and that action and what it has to do with climate change and with diversity and indigenous perspectives on some of these issues. And I also wanted to add, just this morning, I saw that there is a group of 22 young people on the Paul Hartson Bridge, a bridge here in Houston. There are 22 young people trying to stop some petroleum shipments. So, an action on Mauna Kea, an action that's happening here. September 20th is Day of Climate Strikes and Climate Action. It's no matter where you stand on these issues, you'll see these actions happening. And again, that's why I think it's so important that we learn how to talk across difference about these issues as they come up. So Mauna Kea, we're gonna come back to that. And then this idea of moving to higher ground. I love this title. Clark actually suggested it. I love the title because it evokes Mauna Kea and what's happening right now. It evokes sea level rise and folks moving to retreat from anticipated sea level rise. And it also evokes raising our personal vibration. How do we move to a higher ethical ground in how we treat each other in these times of tremendous stress, instability, and uncertainty? Yeah, so somehow we're gonna cover all of that in the next hour. A little climate note, climate trivia. You may recognize this. This is the Keeling curve, one of the first data sets, long-term data sets about climate change since 1958 on Mauna Loa, which is the other mountain peak in Hawaii. And yes, they do have snow on them in the peaks. We do have snow in Hawaii. This Keeling curve was collected from the Mauna Loa Observatory. So this is that upward progression. Sometimes it's called a hockey stick graph that shows global mean temperature increase since 1958. Clark mentioned a few of the national organizations that I work with. It's not like they sponsor me, but I want to mention them just for you. What I want you to get out of this talk is just one new direction to take your own thinking. Yeah, one new direction to take your own thinking and your own feelings, particularly about climate change and impacts. So Clark mentioned that I'm currently working for University of Hawaii System Office of Sustainability. And I wanted to point out the University of Hawaii system logo and motto. This is also the state motto of Hawaii, Ua mau ke ea o ka aina I ka pono. And I'm going to talk about those two words, aina and pono, later in the conversation. So I wanted to point out they are on Hawaii's state motto and system seal. This is the Office of Sustainability's new logo. And we have an executive policy for sustainability that covers all of these areas. I focus on education, but they're all related. So this is another way, if anyone from your college was interested in taking a look at our system-wide executive policy on sustainability, it's been very helpful in guiding curriculum research and operations. I also am on the steering committee for AISHE, and University of Hawaii is a regional center for sustainability across the curriculum. There are 14 of these across the country. AISHE is the Association for the Advancement of Sustainability in Higher Education. They do a lot of operations, campus sustainability kinds of things. So if you have student leaders looking at things like waste reduction, energy reduction, creating zero waste campuses, composting, recycling, those kind of issues, that's kind of what AISHE does. They have a fantastic student summit. The Sustainability Curriculum Consortium is a virtual group of faculty talking about teaching sustainability issues. So if you're an educator, the Sustainability Curriculum Consortium has lots of webinars talking about how to teach sustainability issues, the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, the UN 2030 education goals, a lot of resources like that. I do teach English at Kupiolani Community College. So I've been in community colleges for 20 years. And I'm working with the National Council for Science and the Environment, which is how I met Clark, to develop a community college network. Community colleges have so much to offer and so much great potential, particularly when we talk about preparing for climate impacts. So the project that I talked with Clark about was this research project, the Worry and Hope study, which we conducted across the University of Hawaii system. And one possible outcome of this meeting might be, if you find the study interesting, a group of you might decide to do some focus groups and talk with students here at Tomball, like what do your students know, think, feel, and do about climate change? And how is it same or different from what we found in our study? So we can talk about that after the session. I said I wanted you to get one new thing to think about. So I'm gonna, of course, leave you this presentation. And these are all links. These all could be new things to think about. These are some of the works that are informing today's talk and informing my current thinking. I would call myself, yes, I'm a teacher, but I'm also a climate communicator. And I spend like all day reading about climate change. I talk with scientists, I talk with activists, I talk with teachers, I read some more, then I meditate, then I cry, then I go plant some trees. And I mean, it's what I do all day long. And I really have tried in this talk to squeeze all of this into some ideas for you to think about as a climate communicator. So these are some of my recommendations, and these are some of my people who are here with me today. This is Dr. Chip Fletcher. He's the top climatologist at the University of Hawaii, does a lot of work with the oceans. Dr. Manulani Meyer, who is the Director of Indigenous Education at UH West Oahu. My friend Dina Metzger, who's a writer and has created a Reversing Extinction Council. She works with writers who are witnessing animal extinctions and who are really in empathy with whales and gorillas and a lot of the animals that are at risk right now. My colleague Matt Lynch, who was co-investigator on the study with me and who made all the graphs that you see today. And Kaleo Ten, who is the social media strategist for our office, and he is also on Mauna Kea right now. He's coordinating social media for the Mauna Kea protesters. So those are my peeps, and they are here with me today, And we do have a forthcoming publication that I'll forward to Clark when that comes out. Yeah, so I am going to talk about this study, which was what Clark originally invited me here to talk about. It's been so interesting. The study was called Worry and Hope, and here's a little bit about the study. We conducted 18 student focus groups, and that took about 18 months and involved traveling to all the different campuses and different islands. And we stopped at 18 because we reached this point in research that we call saturation. When we're starting to hear the same thing over and over again, we said, okay, that's probably enough. We transcribed all of these focus group interviews. I did all the transcription myself. And last year, at about this time, at the beginning of the school year, in Hawaii, we were under hurricane warning with Hurricane Lane. Yeah, I think you had a hurricane last year at the start of school too. Is that correct? 2017, okay. Yeah, it seems to be part of the whole back to school thing. My daughter goes to school in Savannah, Georgia, so we were just, navigating with Hurricane Dorian. So last year we had Hurricane Lane, which was projected as a Category 4, even a Category 5 hurricane barreling towards Hawaii. But it was coming, I guess it wasn't barreling, it was coming very slowly. So there were these 5 days that we were under this intense hurricane threat, and we're doing the windows, and we're stocking up food, and we're kind of freaking out because Hawaii has never been hit by a Category 4 or 5 and hasn't been hit for almost 20 years since Iniki hit the island of Kauai. So we were kind of freaking out. I couldn't go to work, so I decided to catch up on doing the transcriptions. So I spent that hurricane time with my earbuds in, listening to students talk about their feelings about climate change and how it's going to impact their future. This was not a good decision for me because it really created a lot of stress. So we transcribed everything and then we coded it using a qualitative software. If anyone's interested in qualitative research methodologies, it's also something really interesting I'd be happy to work with you on. The research question, I just like to put it as, what do students know, think, feel, and do when it comes to sustainability and climate change? That's what we were asking. You think you know, but I'm just going to tell you you don't know until you sit down and talk about it with a group of students. We have a lot of student leaders, and sometimes we think that everybody is as motivated as the student leaders. We have a lot of students who are very, very concerned about climate change to a point of depression and anxiety. And then we have a lot of students that just aren't tracking it at all. It's very inconsistent in your student body, and I want you to think about how that impacts your classrooms and your student clubs and the way your campus is going to approach sustainability. So this was our focus group protocol. There's my colleague Matt doing one of the focus groups. Obviously, we didn't really take pictures at them because it was all confidential. But just to give you a sense of how we went to every campus. We started with an orienting activity. Students had a set of cards. The groups were between 5 students and usually about 10 students. This was a larger group that we broke up. They got a deck of cards that were issues identified by the Union of Concerned Scientists, things like the list that I had put up for you earlier when we were talking. And first we asked them, which of these do you know the most about? Please rank the cards. Yeah. And then we said, okay, so you know a lot about those topics. Which of those would you like to talk about today? We found it doesn't matter where you start the conversation. These issues are so interrelated that you might start out talking about plastics in the ocean. You're going to end up talking about climate change. You might start out talking about animal extinctions. You're going to end up talking about plastics in the ocean. They're all interrelated. So we let them choose. And then we asked them what they know about it. Listened to them talk. And then we said, wow, you really know a lot about this. How do you know what you know? And I'm going to share that result with you. And then we said, well, what do you think can be done about this? And there were a lot of solutions. And then we said, well, what are you actually doing? And I'm going to share that with you. And then we asked them that question, how does this make you feel? Yeah. So that's kind of what I'm going to share with you next. The title of the study came from this quote from a student at one of our community colleges. I said, wow, we've been talking for an hour and a half. How does this make you feel? And she was very thoughtful, and this is what she said. She said, some days you see the news and it's mostly bad and it makes you worse. But other days you see someone making a small little change and you think, no, I feel good. I can take over the world. I can do something. Having a little bit of hope can overpower the doubts. So I think this really captures the way a lot of, I want to say young people, but really everybody, the way we all feel is this kind of precarious place between worry and hope. Like sometimes it's kind of exciting. There's a lot of interesting change going on in society and across the globe right now. And then there's also a lot of worry, and we see a lot of very concerning things on the news, like 17 months before the collapse of civilization, or is it 17 years? You know, we go back and forth between worry and hope. So one thing to think about is what this student said. When you go to campus and you see something like a water refill station or composting or planting the trees or something like that, it shifts that outlook and gives the student kind of a positive perspective. So those things are really valuable. Now, I love how my colleague Matt put this slide together. It shows you what the focus group participants said they wanted to talk about, what they knew the most about, and then what they actually talked about. So what do you take from this slide? Anybody? What do you see here that jumps out at you?
Well, like teaches stuff about water.
About what?
Like no one wants to talk about water.
Yeah, exactly, right? They didn't say they wanted to talk about water or that they even knew a lot about it, but it came up 58 times in the conversations. It ended up being the thing they talked about. Yeah, exactly. Good one. They said they wanted to talk about food and agriculture, but they talked about water and climate change. So I thought that was a very interesting presentation of the data. There was not that much interest in talking about clean energy, which was one of the topics, but it did come up as the third most common thing that they mentioned. The coding software lets you pull out word clouds of the most frequently mentioned topics. So these are them. This is anything mentioned, I think, more than 10 times. The bigger it is, the more often it was mentioned. And then I want to mention another survey that we did at our flagship campus, the University of Hawaii at Manoa. This is a Research One university. 1,600 students took this survey that kind of mirrored that Yale Six Americas study that I showed you at the beginning. 95% of students said they were very concerned or somewhat concerned about climate change. 95% of students. Yeah, so it's very present in our student population. And again, we can talk about how it is the same or different for you here. The difference between somewhat and very really had an interesting data pattern around major. Yeah, so students in our Hawaiian studies and natural science majors were very, very concerned about climate change. 100%, 91%. Tropical ag, 73%. But our students in professional schools like engineering, business, travel industry management, areas that I think need to be thinking about climate impacts, showed a slightly lower level of concern. So this indicates that it's very uneven across the curriculum, whether or not students are, in fact, talking about and learning about climate change impacts. So we asked students know a lot about climate change impacts. And we asked them, how do you know all this stuff that you know? At first, I didn't really believe it when students were saying, oh, I see it with my own eyes. They talked about their lived experience as their number one source of information about climate change and global warming. These are 20-year-old students. I'm like, you're too young to see these changes with your own eyes. But over and over again, it was the most common thing that they mentioned. How do you know what you know? It's the beaches that I grew up on. It's the food that I'm eating. Things like, it used to snow on my birthday, but now it doesn't snow on my birthday. That was a student from Washington State. Stories from their grandparents, eroding shorelines, changing sea levels, surf spots that were different, seeing it with their own eyes. The least commonly mentioned source of climate knowledge was college faculty. So what's up with that? And then there's all of this in the middle, all these different media sources. This is kind of a whole different talk about climate communication. Maybe this is the talk that Clark would give about, fake news versus social media, the K-12 national science standards, a whole different conversation, and the social exchange of information. I included, where do you learn what you know about climate change? From my peers, at my workplace, and at the bar. That was mentioned only twice, but I put it up there because it did come up twice. When prompted, which classes are you learning about climate change? It was kind of distributed across the curriculum. Again, might like to see at my own college a little more focus from our technology and CTE fields, because these are the areas where a lot of adaptation efforts can come from and that will be really impacted. But a lot from social sciences and arts and humanities. So I'm an English teacher. I teach a lot of sustainability and climate change in my classes, so I thought that was an interesting finding as well. This one I'm not going to talk a lot about, but it's not surprising that the actions students focus on are the things that they can control. Yeah, so students were very focused on reducing consumption and packaging, avoiding single-use plastics, carrying their own cutlery kits, this kind of thing. I don't know if that's a thing here, but I think in Hawaii, especially being in the middle of the ocean, we're so focused on the oceans and the plastics issue. So that was big, changing their eating habits, being vegetarian, being vegan. I don't know if that's a thing here or not, but we can talk about that. Those are the things they mentioned the most, and then getting out and doing something. Building things, planting trees, that kind of thing. So here's the one that I've really been thinking about over the past year, and especially since I've been talking with Clark. What do students feel about sustainability and climate issues? And you guys each wrote down a feeling. What we found over 18 months on 8 different campuses in 18 different focus groups was a pervasive attitude or emotional climate of fear, anger, sadness, shame, and hope. Yeah. So I think this is very interesting as an educator to think about as a background emotional climate, whether or not we're talking about these issues in the classroom. These are all of the emotion words that students use. The ones I showed you earlier in the talk are in bold. Those are ones that were mentioned more than 10 times. So what I'm working with this list, I'm trying to arrange them as a spectrum, right? How does someone get from feeling a little bit powerless or maybe detached to feeling shocked and overwhelmed, right? There's a spectrum there. How do we identify where someone might be at on that spectrum and keep from getting into shocked and overwhelmed? How does someone get from, like, it's a little irritating to I'm really angry about this? Yeah. So notice whatever word you wrote down, maybe where did it fall in the spectrum? How does someone get from feeling a little bit disappointed about how some of these things affect your future to feeling devastated or hopeless. Devastated and hopeless are not things that I want students in my class in college to be feeling. These are not ways that you want to be feeling when you're 20, 22, 25 years old. Is there someone at the door who wants to come in? Oh, okay. Well, they can come on in. I saw you guys looking out there. This issue of shame, I wasn't expecting, but I did some research on emotions, and shame is actually one of like the core human emotions. And I thought these words kind of fall in there. I feel embarrassed. I feel gross. It gives me a visceral reaction talking about these issues. What do we do with that type of environmental shame in the classroom? And then how do we get to hopeful, determined, and responsible, which is, I think, the most productive place to be. And I'm going to call that like a climate acceptance, climate reality. How do we get from, it seems to start with an attitude of humility and gratitude. That's the beginning of hope. So how do we start from gratitude and get to hopeful, determined, empowered? Right? That's interesting. Any comments here? I think this is a really interesting part of the work. Anybody see their emotion that they wrote down on this list? Any teachers who've seen this in your classrooms? My word? Oh. I'm actually going to tell a story about that forward, but thank you. I will share that when I get there. It's not one. It's like all of them, you know. But I am going to share that story in a few slides, so thank you. What was yours?
You don't want to know, it's kind of sad. I was hopeless.
Hopeless.
But I'm older, so it's okay.
This issue...
I'm not 20, I'm 50.
This issue is very different if you're 20 or if you're 50. It really is. Or if you're 4 or if you're 74, right? It's very different depending on those diversity differences that I mentioned at the beginning. So, yeah. Okay, so this is for teachers in the room, educators. Some of the educational pedagogical models that we look at in sustainability education. With sustainability education, it's very often mentioned head, heart, and hands model, which means thinking about it, feeling about it, and then like getting out and doing something. That's where service learning comes in, right? If you learn about a problem and then you go out and you work with it, then you learn more about it and you tend to feel more positive about it. This paper I mentioned here by Singleton added the component of place. Head, heart, hands, and then place. All of these things are part of an effective education about this. So if that's not what you're experiencing or not what you're teaching, how can you add that missing component? Head, heart, hands, place. I have studied transformative learning theory a lot, and this is another really interesting area to go, the work of Jack Mesereau. Mesereau talks about transformative learning that can happen like that. It's called an epical transformative moment. It's a moment where you get it, and then you're never the same after that. You know, have you ever had that kind of a moment? As a teacher, I think about how can I create that kind of a moment for someone. You get it, you see something, and then you can't ever unsee it again. That's transformative learning. And then I went all the way back into research on knowledge translation and knowledge brokering or intersectionality, and found this awesome work by Michael Poliani from the late 50s and the 60s. And he talked about tacit learning, right? You can learn something in your head, but then there's this tacit learning that he called an indwelling. An indwelling. Yeah, so how do we get to there? And I will tell you, it won't come from a PowerPoint, right? That talk that I showed you at the beginning, sink, burn, blown away, what I call the oh shit talk about climate change, is not going to give you that indwelling. It's only going to go in your head, and then you're just going to kind of block it out. How do you create this head, heart, hands, place, transformative indwelling of this information? This is between you and you. This is between you and nature. Yeah? Maybe this happens with a close friend. Maybe it happens with an animal or a tree. Did you want to tell a story, Clark? Oh, I thought Clark had a transformative learning story. So I've been looking at what creates that moment. And now here is something that nobody's ever said before, and it's the first time that I'm sharing these thoughts out loud. So I think it has something to do with the structure of our brain. One, our brains are rather ill-equipped to think about climate change. And that has to do with the structure of how we react to time and how the frontal lobe matures and all these different kinds of things. But I read this book. If you're interested in brain stuff, I really recommend this book. It's called The Master and His Emissary. Yeah? And it has nothing to do about climate change, but I think it does. Yeah? So this book is looking at how we think about the left and right hemispheres of the brain. We call the left hemisphere logical and the right hemisphere creative, right? That's completely just a gross oversimplification and just actually not true is what this book is proposing. In fact, we have two separate brains inside your head. There are actually two separate brains, and they need to cooperate. The left hemisphere tends to focus more closely on things that are known. And the right hemisphere tends to maybe focus more broadly, kind of scanning the environment. And that's what this book is about. The hemispheres of our brain are kind of torqued like this a little bit, if you were looking at like this, making the left hemisphere a little bit dominant. Now, isn't that interesting? The left hemisphere has become a little bit dominant. That's the master. The right hemisphere has become the emissary. That's the title. That's what the title of the book is about. So this culture that we live in, our Western culture and our Western mindset, is it maybe our brains? Has our culture created an imbalance in these hemispheres? Or have our brains evolved to create the culture? You know what I'm saying? Like, what is driving? Is the culture driving the brain, or is the brain driving the culture? And what might this have to do with our mindset regarding climate change? You might know the name Donella Meadows if you've read anything about systems thinking. Yeah, she's kind of the grandmother of systems thinking, Donella Meadows. The book is called How to Design a Spherical Cow, I think. Systems thinking work. So she lists 10 ways to change a system. And I've worked on all of these. We've had carbon taxes, right? You even mentioned those at the beginning. We've talked about positive feedback loops or information, sharing information, teaching, creating incentives, creating disincentives, creating groups and organizing, writing mission statements, changing our goals. All of these things are ways to change a system, but what's number one? Changing the mindset or the paradigm from which the system is generated. Now, isn't that interesting to think about if you're in college, right? What is your mindset? What is the paradigm that you are absorbing and that you want to take forward into your life? What is your mindset and what is your paradigm? So here's where I want to kind of take a break, kind of let that sink in and shift gears a little bit. And I want to talk about the relationship of mindset to diversity. What does mindset have to do with diversity, equity, and inclusion? So I want to talk about things like an indigenous epistemology, earth-centered thinking, non-dual thinking, whole brain thinking, and the mantra of sustainability and improv, which is yes and, not no but yes and. How do those things come into this? Okay, here's where I'm going to do the tricky bit of switching over to a video. And I think it's going to work. I did test it, but I don't know because now we're in the system. So wish me luck. We're going to have about 4 minutes of the video. You will have the link if you want to go back and watch the conclusion of the video. I wanted you to have a sense of what's happening in Hawaii. Protected mode is turned off. I don't think I care about that. I don't think I want to add on.
Regardless of what they bring at us. Standing kapu aloha, stand aloha aina, stand up.
Thanks, Claire.
Kapu aloha, it is the way you carry yourself. It has dignity and uprightness and integrity for your land, and your kupuna, and your mahua, and all things around it. It is a consideration for something outside of yourself.
Because we are pono in everything that we do. So please, I ask of everybody, hold yourself to your highest standards. Create new standards today. Hold yourself to that. And once you get to that point, you can go even higher.
And people, that's where the confusion is. People think, oh, aloha, aloha. But they're looking at an institutionalized and commercialized version of aloha. We're talking about aloha that carries the land. Talking about aloha that carries the land.
22 minutes left.
Okay.
People are very frustrated by that strategy because they have no understanding of where it's coming from. That it's something that's made up. In reality, it is a long-standing practice we've always had. We've always had. Yet it was in our law, and it was in the principles of, even on the battlefield, of how to enter into a battle with integrity. It is good to have anger, but how to redirect that anger into positive means, now that is kapu aloha. You have a beloved being of ours that we cherish and honor, Kamakau, one of the great historians, and we know the battle is not with you. It is when you look at the piko and the mole, we are at the root and we are ohana, we are family. And we're in a system that's dividing and separating us, only by appearance. The kapu aloha that we hold is for you specifically because of who you, and how we chose you to come forward to us. It's hard,
And the feeling's not mutual. Trust me, I have a hard time, but I gotta do my job.
I know. I'm going to stop the video right when they come into this conflict. And I'm going to hopefully be able to go back to my slideshow. Just minimize it. Okay. Okay. Hopefully it'll work. I'm going to come back to, oops, now I'm back here. I want to come back to this scene from that video because it gives me chicken skin, that scene. And it looks like a conflict, right? Here are two men. They're actually both Hawaiian. It's their role. One is working for the Department of Land and Natural Resources, and the other is an activist. So how do these two men come to be in these different positionalities in relationship to the sacred mountain? And you can see this is not a recent video. It's been going on a long time. The conflict is really coming to a head right now. But my teacher, Manu Meyer, she said, this is not a conflict. This is not a protest. She said, that's a wrong way to see it. We want to not see it as native practice versus Western science. She said, that's the wrong way to think about it. Yeah. So I look at this, these two men like this, and I just see a conflict. I just see, what's going to happen? What are they going to do? But what Manu tells me from an indigenous framework, she says it's not a conflict, it's an affirmation of our love of land. The kapu aloha, kapu means in Hawaiian, it's sometimes translated as like off limits. Like there'll be a sign that says kapu, you can't go there. But she said what kapu really means is a reverence, a respect for. Kapu aloha is a reverence for love. And in Hawaiian culture, aloha is not just hello, goodbye, I love you. Aloha is everything. It's the entire mindset of aloha. So an indigenous mindset, how do we shift from seeing this as a conflict to seeing this as kapu aloha, an affirmation of love of land? One thing that I do to get out of my own mindset is every day I consult I Ching. Yeah, are you familiar with the I Ching? It's a 5,000-year-old book from the Taoist tradition. Yeah, so I get into philosophy. I practice philosophy every day by looking at the I Ching to get into my other side of my brain, to step back out of my left brain, out of my Western mindset, and how can I look at something from a Taoist philosophy or from a different mindset? For me, it's a great practice. So Stephen Karcher is one of the translators of the I Ching. And I was consulting I Ching about this situation and found this quote from Stephen Karcher. He said, looking at pairs, yin and yang, native and Western, indigenous, different mindsets, is like a set of spindles on which an unbroken thread wound back and forth like a Mobius strip, like a great egg that turns itself inside out without breaking its shell. This was the other place where I'd like to suggest, as we're, kind of going to come into our conclusion here, maybe write down one word that you're thinking right now, or one phrase from this quote. What does that mean? Back and forth like a Mobius strip. Spindles of inspiration and realization circulating through a series of hidden pathways that establish the deep background of a situation. Each thing can only exist when held in creative tension with its opposite. Like, what is going on? What are we talking about here? When we talk about climate disruption, when we talk about these young people occupying a bridge right here in Houston this morning, we talk about these debates tonight, Democrats versus Republicans, like what is really going on and how can we change our mindset to create a new experience? The symbol of resilience theory is the Mobius strip. So you look up any website about climate resilience or about mental resilience, right? We talk about grit and resilience, psychological resilience is a Mobius strip of things that come up, then they fall, and they change, and this happens at an individual level, a community level, a regional level, and a planetary level, yeah? The Mobius strip is a symbol of resilience theory. It is the model of resilience theory. There's been a lot in the media about climate anxiety and some of the terms, environmental grief, pre-traumatic stress syndrome, and my favorite one, solastalgia, which is a combination of the word solace, comfort, and nostalgia, a nostalgia for times past. This is often compared to the stages of grief. And this is where I was going to share my own story. A friend very close to me committed suicide. So I'm familiar with these stages of grief. There's a big shock when you find the body of someone who's committed suicide. There's denial. Well, maybe it's not really him. There's anger. How could you do this to us? There's a bargaining, usually a bargaining with God. Oh, if only. There's a depression, which for me took about 3 or 4 years. And then you come to this place where you can accept a death and you can move on. You're probably thinking of some story, whether it's the death of a cat or a friend or a grandparent. You understand intuitively almost these stages of grief. This is theory by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. So we applied this to climate. We get the shock, right? That oh shit talk that I mentioned. It's very uncomfortable, and we really don't like it. We have stage of denial, anger. I'm not saying that all the youth climate strikers or the young people up on your bridge today, I'm not saying they're all angry, but anger is certainly a present emotion that you're going to see, especially on those September 20 climate strikes. I see with students at our college some bargaining in, like, if I just never use a straw again, then all of this will go away. Because I am a vegan and I hold myself to this vegan standard and I never eat an animal product, it's going to go away. It's a type of bargaining. That's just my personal theory. Depression, we've been talking about the highest rate of teen suicide and suicidal ideologies that we've seen since 2009, which was the last economic depression. So are these things related? How do we get to a place of acceptance? How do we get to a climate reality? I'll just tell you, it feels better when you get to a place where you're not thinking about 17 months or 17 years to live, but like, what is my climate reality in my lifetime, in my place, right here, right now? Yeah. What do we do with some of these projections? We have to accept a 1.1 global mean temperature increase as of now. That's where we're at. It looks unlikely that we'll be able to hold to that 2 degrees warming by 2030 that the Paris Agreement is all about. Of course, we want to try, but might not happen. So what are we talking about? And that's what this timeline activity is about. What are we talking about at 2020, at 2050, at 2080, at 2100? Yeah. And what is worth doing? As we kind of draw this first session to a conclusion, I don't want to leave you without strategies, right? It is definitely worth eating less meat. It is a major climate impact. It is definitely worth reducing driving and flying. It is so worth taking the time to talk to someone. Yeah, talk to someone in your family. Talk to someone you think isn't interested in climate change whatsoever. Reach out across difference. Read everything. Start with this book, Drawdown by Paul Hawken, 100 Climate Solution Ranked by Cost and Efficacy. Learn a practical skill. Learn how to build a house, learn how to do sandbags, learn how to grow food, learn CPR, train as a disaster responder. Do something practical that's going to empower you in an emergency situation. Vote and think about what you want in your voice. Spend quiet time in nature. Meditate. Practice your own spiritual practice. And then I don't quite know how to say this. Like, focus on this every day, but don't dwell on it. You know, focus on it and then enjoy your life. And most importantly, change your mindset about climate change. And looking to communities of difference and diversity, look outside of your own mindset. Look outside of your family and your people. Look across difference for that inspiration. I find a lot of inspiration in indigenous mindset and what's happening on Mauna Kea. That's why I share it with you. Change your mindset of time, your paradigm of time. Professor Kyle White at Michigan, anyone who wants to read more about climate equity, everything by Kyle White is super interesting. He says, what do you mean it's a climate crisis? Our community has been in crisis for the last 200 years. He's talking about Native American perspectives. I recently, this summer, added Grapes of Wrath to the reading list for my climate fiction class. Was John Steinbeck writing a climate fiction novel in 1932? He wrote about the first climate migrations within this country, the Okies, right? They were white people, and they were discriminated against as they had to move as a result of the Dust Bowl. That's climate migration. That's a climate novel written in 1932. And in fact, global warming was part of the Dust Bowl. It wasn't their management of topsoil. Global warming has been happening since 1900, since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, and even since the beginning of agriculture. It's just accelerating now. Change your perspective of time. You feel nostalgic for, you know, the 80s when this wasn't happening. Well, this was happening. I just didn't know about it when I was in high school. It was a topic of conversation in 1979. We've been charting different future scenarios, right? Nobody knows what exactly is going to happen in 17 months or in 17 years. We don't know. We have a set of projections and a number of parts per million of carbon in the atmosphere. We're already at a place where there's more carbon in the atmosphere than has ever been before, even in the time of the dinosaurs. So we're living in an experiment. We don't know, yeah? So there's lots of different projected future impacts. The idea is reducing carbon emissions by half by each decade. The longer we wait to do that, the steeper the decline needs to be. These are the kind of projections that people are talking about. Right now, we had a dip in 2017. Global carbon emissions do not appear to be decreasing. So how do we think about the future and shift our paradigm of time? Yeah. We're going to look, if you are able to stay in the next activity, we're going to look more deeply at this 7 stages to transition. Or you can just take this thought and take them into your next activity or that other diversity film. I want to remind you some of the Hawaiian words you learned today. One is pau, which means this talk is finished. The other is mahalo, which is thank you. Aloha is everything. Love. Malama aina, care for the land and that which feeds us. And malama pono, which means care for yourself. Take care, be well.
Thanks very much. Thank you very much.